Why do the rituals of the Roman Bacchanalia, officially annihilated by the Senate in the year 186 before the Common Era, resurface with chilling precision in the interrogation records of French nobility over 1,500 years later? How can we explain that the personal grimoire of a Marshal of France contained exact copies of incantations found etched onto cursed tablets in the volcanic ash of Pompeii? The answer is not a neat line drawn through history. It is a serpent coiled in the shadows of power, shedding its skin with each passing empire but never changing its nature. It begins not with a horned beast but with wine, ecstasy, and a promise whispered in the ear of a Roman patrician that gods are not to be worshipped but to be become. The Senate called it a conspiracy against the state. They were not wrong. The Bacchanalia were more than drunken revels. They were a parallel society, a network of influence that bound senators, generals, and their wives in oaths of blood and secrecy. The official reports speak of debauchery. The secret reports, the ones burned by order of the consuls, spoke of something else. The systematic use of ritual to break the mind, to erase morality, and to forge a new kind of human, one loyal only to the cult. The Praetorian Guard did not move against them because of mere orgies. They moved because the cult was choosing its own consuls. They moved because Rome, the master of the world, was about to get a new master from the shadows. The suppression was brutal. Thousands were executed. The shrines were torn down. Yet a king's greatest fear is never the enemy at the gate, but the poison in his wine, a poison brewed not in a laboratory, but in the human heart's thirst for the forbidden. You cannot kill an idea by killing its followers. You only drive it deeper underground. The rites of Bacchus, or the force they represented, did not vanish. They seeped into the foundations of the dying empire, waiting. They found fertile ground in the dark forests of Gaul, among the warrior kings who would inherit the rubble of Rome. The Merovingians, the long-haired kings, were a strange dynasty. Their power was said to reside in their uncut hair, a link to ancient pre-Christian forces. Christian chroniclers called them pious. But court rumors told a different story. They spoke of sacred groves where the old gods were still honored, not with prayers, but with blood. They whispered of rituals conducted in the cellars of rustic villas, rituals that looked remarkably like the suppressed rites of Bacchus, but with a colder, more northern cruelty. Here, the goal was not ecstatic union with a god, it was a direct transaction, power for a soul, victory in battle for a blood sacrifice. The royal court was not a place of governance, it was a serpent's nest of ambition. Accusations of devil worship became the sharpest political tool available. A rival queen could be removed not by poison, which was crude, but by a carefully placed rumor of a black mass, a charge impossible to disprove. What would you do if you discovered the ruler of your country was turning to dark forces for power? Would you expose them, risking civil war, or would you seek to control that power for yourself? The early Frankish courts were a brutal theater of survival. Power was personal, visceral. It was won by the sword and held by fear. In such a world, any advantage was sought, any taboo considered for violation. Secret societies flourished not as philosophical clubs, but as practical alliances for conspiracy and assassination. A pact was not sealed with a handshake, but with a shared crime, a ritual murder that bound the participants in a silence of mutual terror. The Christian church was young and its grip was tenuous. It fought against these resurgent pagan practices, but it often fought a losing battle. The bishops who condemned the old ways by day were sometimes the very men who sought out hedge witches by night, seeking prophecies or curses against their rivals in the clergy. The concept of a singular, all-powerful Satan had not yet been fully forged in the fires of theology. Instead, they spoke of older, darker things, the spirits of the forest, the forgotten gods of the Celts and Romans, forces that did not demand worship, but offered bargains. A king might attend Mass in the morning and sacrifice a bull to a horned god in the evening, seeing no contradiction. One was for the salvation of his soul, the other for the security of his throne. It was a dangerous duality, a spiritual tightrope walk that defined the soul of early medieval Europe. The world was enchanted, and not all of its enchantments were holy. The legend of King Clovis converting to Christianity is a cornerstone of French history. But the stories they don't tell are of his grandfather Merivesh, the sea beast from whom the dynasty took its name, a creature born of a woman and a kinator of the sea. Myth, perhaps. But myths tell a deeper truth about how a people see their rulers. They saw them as something more than human, touched by forces beyond the veil. This belief was the source of their authority and also their curse. To maintain that aura, the Merovingian kings had to live on the edge of the sacred and the profane. Their courts were filled with seers, necromancers, and poisoners, all offering shortcuts to power. The chronicles of Gregory of Tours are filled with accounts of royal women like Fredegund and Brunhilde, queens who used assassination, torture, and witchcraft as instruments of statecraft. They did not see it as evil, they saw it as necessary. They were the mothers of a new civilization, and childbirth is a bloody affair. The poison they brewed was not just for their enemies, it was a toxin that seeped into the very bloodstream of the European aristocracy. The idea that a ruler was above the laws of God and man, that they had the right to make pacts with any power necessary to secure their legacy, was born in these dark, violent centuries. The forests of Europe held these secrets for generations. But as the continent became more connected, these whispers traveled. They moved along the trade routes, carried by merchants and mercenaries. They found their way east to a city that considered itself the center of the world, a place of unimaginable wealth and sophistication, a city where the intrigues of the Merovingians would seem like the clumsy brawling of children. This new bastion of power was a golden cage, a place where civilization had reached a fever pitch of refinement and paranoia. The whispers of dark rituals, of pacts made for power, would find a new and terrifying home there. They would be polished, intellectualized, and made 1,000 times more deadly. This city was Constantinople, the heart of the Byzantine Empire, and it was here that the crude sorcery of the barbarian West would be transformed into a terrifying art form. What if the most effective way to protect your legacy wasn't a prayer, but a curse? Tell us in the comments what you would choose, a divine blessing for your descendants or a demonic curse on your enemies. Your secret is safe with us. Constantinople was a city of God, but its foundations rested on a labyrinth of older, darker beliefs. The Queen of Cities was not just the heart of orthodoxy. It was a magnet for every mystic, astrologer, an alchemist from Alexandria to the Persian frontier. The emperor did not just rule by divine right, he ruled by balancing the brutal realities of power with the unseen currents of fate, which he sought to control by any means necessary. The imperial palace was a universe unto itself, a glittering prison of silk and marble where eunuchs with sharpened minds and silent feet held more power than generals. Here, poison was a more respected art than diplomacy, and a well-timed astrological prediction could topple a dynasty. The historian Michael Sellos, a man who served 11 emperors and saw most of them meet violent ends, wrote chronicles that read like a manual of paranoid survival. He speaks of emperors who conversed with demons as casually as they did with their advisors, men who believed their grasp on the throne was maintained not by their armies, but by the binding of infernal spirits in subterranean chambers beneath the palace. Kings feared the poison in their wine, failing to notice the poison they themselves summoned into their souls during midnight masses. In Byzantium, heresy was not just a theological error, it was high treason because to challenge the emperor's faith was to challenge the divine source of his power. Could you resist the temptation to make a deal that guarantees you the throne, even if that deal involved forces you did not understand? The Byzantine elite faced this question daily. The struggle for the purple was a blood sport. Emperors were blinded, castrated, poisoned, and strangled with a terrifying regularity. In this atmosphere of constant lethal threat, Christianity was a comfort, but for many it was not enough. They needed an edge. They turned to the forbidden arts not out of a love for evil, but out of sheer desperation. They sought out Chaldean sorcerers for protective amulets, Egyptian necromancers to divine the loyalty of their court, and philosophers who dabbled in theurgy, the art of compelling gods and demons to do one's bidding. The city's great libraries held not only the works of the Church Fathers, but also smuggled copies of grimoires, texts of Solomonic magic, and treatises on the summoning of spirits. The same aristocrat who would commission a magnificent icon of Christ Pantocrator might also pay a fortune for a cursed relic, an idol said to bring madness and death to any who stood in the way of its owner. The line between sacred relic and cursed artifact was dangerously thin, often depending on who held it and for what purpose. They did not see it as a pact with Satan. They saw it as wielding a different kind of weapon in a war with no rules. The palace itself was a fortress of secrets. Beneath the golden mosaics of the Hagia Sophia and the opulent halls of the great palace lay a hidden world of cisterns, tunnels, and forgotten chambers. It was in these dark, damp places that the empire's true business was often conducted. While the emperor held court in dazzling splendor above below, his agents might be torturing a suspected conspirator, a magician might be casting a curse on a rival general, or a cabal of aristocrats might be swearing a blood oath to overthrow the man on the throne. The Varangian Guard, the fearsome Viking mercenaries who served as the emperor's personal protectors, were famously loyal to the man who paid them, but they had their own gods and their own dark rites. Many an emperor slept uneasily, knowing that the men guarding his door honored a god of war who valued a glorious death in battle far more than a long life of service. The paranoia was all-encompassing. Food was tasted for poison, letters were read for hidden codes, and every shadow was suspected of holding an assassin. This was the price of sitting on the most coveted throne in the world, to live in a state of perpetual fear, trusting no one and knowing that the prayer on a courtier's lips could easily mask a curse in his heart. The executions for heresy and witchcraft in Constantinople were theatrical displays of absolute power. Aristocrats who had been caught plotting or simply fallen out of favor would be accused of consorting with demons. It was a charge that stripped them of all dignity and support. They would be paraded through the hippodrome, not as political enemies, but as monsters, corrupted souls who had sought to bring demonic plagues upon the city. Their trials were swift, their confessions extracted by methods that defied imagination. The punishments were equally symbolic. Some were burned alive, their bodies offered as a sacrifice to the god they had supposedly betrayed. Others were sewn into sacks with snakes and thrown into the Bosporus, a pagan punishment for the ultimate crime. These brutal spectacles served a dual purpose. They eliminated a threat and they reinforced the emperor's position as the defender of the faith, the holy warrior standing between a righteous Christian empire and the forces of darkness. Yet, ironically, the very emperor who ordered these purges might be the one most deeply entangled in the practices he publicly condemned. He was merely eliminating the competition. The most dangerous heretic is not the one who worships a different god, but the one who seeks to summon yours for his own purposes. This sophisticated, intellectualized approach to the occult, this blend of high theology and practical demonology, would eventually find its way back to the West. It traveled in the minds of crusading knights who were both awed and corrupted by the splendors and sins of Constantinople. They saw an empire that used every weapon, spiritual and temporal, to maintain its power. And one group of warrior monks in particular learned this lesson all too well. They were the most elite fighting force of the Crusades, a brotherhood that was also Europe's first multinational corporation, a military and financial powerhouse that answered only to the Pope. They were the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, the Knights Templar. They would be accused of learning the darkest secrets of the East, of spitting on the cross, and of worshipping a demonic head in their secret chapter meetings. They would be accused of becoming the very evil they had sworn to destroy, their cross turning from a symbol of faith to one of heresy. The secrets they supposedly guarded would lead to their annihilation and birth a legend of a hidden treasure, a lost fleet, and a curse that would echo through the centuries, a curse leveled from the flames against a king and a pope. The rise of the Knights Templar was meteoric. In less than 2 centuries, an order of 9 knights founded to protect pilgrims on the roads to Jerusalem became the wealthiest and most formidable institution in Christendom, second only to the papacy itself. They were warriors, bankers, and diplomats. Their commanderies dotted the landscape from London to the Holy Land. They owned vast tracts of land, financed wars, and held the crowns of European monarchs in their debt. They were admired, feared, and envied, and it was this envy that would be their undoing. King Philip IV of France, a man known as the Fair for his looks but not for his character, was deeply in their debt. He saw in the Templars not just a creditor, but a state within a state, a secret brotherhood whose power and loyalty were not to France, but to their own mysterious Grand Master. Philip, pious and ruthless in equal measure, decided to destroy them, but he could not simply default on his debts. He needed a reason so monstrous, so shocking, that it would justify the annihilation of God's own holy warriors. He found his reason in the whispers that had long followed the order, whispers of heresy, idolatry, and black magic learned in the East. On Friday, October the 13th, in the year 1307, a date that would live in infamy, agents of King Philip launched a coordinated surprise raid across all of France. Every Templar, from the highest commander to the newest recruit, was arrested. The charges were breathtaking in their scope and depravity. They were accused of denying Christ and spitting upon the crucifix during their secret initiation rites. They were accused of institutionalized sodomy, of ritualistic kisses on the groin and the base of the spine, and most damningly, they were accused of worshipping an idol, a mysterious bearded head which they called Baphomet. The Inquisition, now under the thumb of the French king, was put in charge of the interrogations. Under relentless, systematic torture, the knights began to confess. They spoke of midnight ceremonies where the crucifix was trampled underfoot, of being forced into obscene acts by their superiors, and of adoring a demonic head that promised them wealth and power. Was this the truth? Or was it the greatest and most successful smear campaign in history, the ravings of men broken by unimaginable pain, saying anything their tormentors wanted to hear to make the agony stop? The trial of the Templars was a masterpiece of political theatre. The confessions, extracted by rack and fire, were read out in public. The people of France were horrified. The knights, who had been the heroes of the Crusades, were revealed as devil worshippers, a cancer within the body of Christ. Pope Clement V, a weak man and a virtual prisoner of the French king, was pressured to sanction the persecution. He tried to resist, to hold his own hearings, but the momentum of Philip's machine was unstoppable. Knights who dared to retract their forced confessions were declared relapsed heretics and burned at the stake without mercy. The Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, and his commanders were subjected to years of imprisonment and interrogation. The objective was not just to destroy the men, it was to utterly obliterate the order's reputation, and most importantly, to seize its legendary treasure. But here, Philip was frustrated. The vast Templar treasury, the gold and silver that had propped up European thrones, was never found. On the eve of the arrests, the Templar fleet had slipped out of the port of La Rochelle and vanished from the pages of history, taking the order's wealth and its greatest secrets with it. The final act of the tragedy took place on an island in the Seine, in the shadow of Notre Dame Cathedral. In March of the year 1314, Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Temple, was brought before a tribunal of cardinals and sentenced to life in prison. But at that moment, the old warrior found his courage. He rose and proclaimed his innocence and that of his order, declaring the confessions to be lies forced from them by torture. He condemned the greed of the king and the weakness of the Pope. A furious King Philip ordered him to be burned as a relapsed heretic that very same day. From the flames of his pyre, Jacques de Molay is said to have uttered a final, terrible curse. He summoned King Philip and Pope Clement to join him before the judgment seat of God within the year. The curse of a dying man is a powerful thing, but the curse of the last Grand Master of a holy order was something more. Pope Clement died of a wasting disease just 1 month later. King Philip the Fair died in a hunting accident before the year was out. Coincidence, perhaps? But for the people of Europe, it was proof that the Templars, even in death, wielded a terrible power. The Brotherhood was destroyed, but its shadow, the spectre of Baphomet and the legend of the curse, would haunt the French monarchy for generations, a reminder that some powers, once invoked, cannot be easily dismissed. The curse, it seemed, had fallen not just on a man, but on the very heart of Christendom itself, the papal throne, which would soon be occupied by a family whose name would become a synonym for corruption, murder, and, as their enemies whispered, a diabolical pact with the forces of hell, the Borgias. The ashes of Jacques de Molay's pyre had barely cooled before the institution he cursed began to rot from within. The papacy, weakened and discredited by its submission to the French crown, moved to Avignon, becoming a puppet of kings. But it was its return to Rome in the following century that set the stage for a scandal so profound it would make the charges against the Templars seem tame. The Renaissance had dawned, a glorious explosion of art, science, and humanism. But with this new light came a new and deeper shadow. In the quest to rediscover the knowledge of the ancient world, some rediscovered its gods and its demons. The papal throne, the seat of the Vicar of Christ, became the ultimate prize in a deadly game played by ambitious Italian families. And no family played that game with more ruthless brilliance than the Borgias. When Cardinal Rodrigo Borgia, a man of immense charm, ambition, and appetites, bought his way to the papacy in 1492, taking the name Alexander VI, he did not just ascend a throne. He hijacked the spiritual authority of 1 billion souls and twisted it into a weapon for his family's advancement. The Vatican, the rock upon which the Church was built, became the stage for a spectacle of debauchery, incest, and political assassination that horrified even the cynical heart of Renaissance Italy. The court of Pope Alexander VI was not a holy place, it was a viper's pit. His children, for he made no secret of them, were his chief instruments of power. Juan, the arrogant general, Cesare, the brilliant and utterly amoral cardinal turned warlord, and Lucrezia, the beautiful pawn in her family's dynastic games, whose name would be unfairly blackened for centuries. Together they sought to carve a permanent kingdom for the Borgia family out of the patchwork of the papal states. Their methods were direct and brutal. Rivals were eliminated with a speed and efficiency that gave rise to legends of a secret Borgia poison, La Cantarella, a tasteless arsenic compound that left no trace. Cardinals who stood in their way, or whose wealth they coveted, would die suddenly after dining with the Pope, their fortunes conveniently reverting to the papal treasury. But the whispers went beyond mere murder and greed. They spoke of things that desecrated the very sanctity of the apostolic palace. Rumors spread of the Ballet of the Chestnuts, a notorious banquet held in the Vatican where 50 prostitutes were said to have danced naked for the Pope and his children, with prizes awarded for the most vigorous sexual performances. Fact or fiction, the story captured the essence of the Borgia reign, a complete and utter rejection of the morality they were supposed to uphold. They had not made a pact with the devil. They had, in the eyes of their enemies, made him Pope. Cesare Borgia, the Pope's favorite son, was the chilling embodiment of the new Renaissance man as described by Machiavelli, who used him as a model for the prince. He was handsome, intelligent, and completely devoid of conscience. He resigned his position as a cardinal, the first man in history to do so, to take up the sword and lead the papal armies. His campaigns were models of military genius and absolute cruelty. Cities that resisted him were sacked, their leaders executed. He moved like a phantom, striking his enemies before they even knew they were at war. He was the master of the nighttime assassination, the public spectacle of execution, the carefully orchestrated betrayal. He lived by the motto aut Caesar, aut nihil, either Caesar or nothing. He was a man who seemed to draw power from the very act of transgression. His enemies whispered that his uncanny success, his ability to anticipate his rivals' moves, was not due to mere cunning. They claimed he consulted with astrologers and dark sorcerers, that he performed rituals to gain insight into the future and to place curses upon those who opposed him. Could you resist the temptation to use forbidden knowledge if it guaranteed you victory? The question is not whether Cesare Borgia believed in such things, but whether his enemies believed it, and that fear was a weapon as potent as any sword or poison. The brilliance of the Renaissance was a bonfire that cast deep, dancing shadows. While Michelangelo painted the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, the Borgias were, according to their accusers, holding black masses in the cellars of the Vatican. While Leonardo da Vinci sketched the future of human flight, agents of the Pope were hunting down his enemies across Italy. It was an age of dizzying contradictions. The pursuit of classical knowledge led some to Neoplatonism and humanism, but it led others to rediscover ancient mystery cults and the dark arts of hermetic magic. The line between science and sorcery was not yet drawn. An astronomer was also an astrologer, a chemist was also an alchemist. For a man like Pope Alexander, who believed in nothing but power, all knowledge was a tool. If a prayer could secure a political alliance, he would pray. If a poison could remove an obstacle, he would use it. And if a forbidden ritual could give him an edge, his enemies had no doubt he would embrace it without a moment's hesitation. The ultimate blasphemy of the Borgias was not that they were sinners, it was that they wore the robes of saints while doing the work of devils, and in doing so, they revealed a terrifying truth, that the most sacred places can host the most profound evil. What price would you pay for absolute power? Would you sacrifice your honor, or would you sacrifice your soul? Let us know your choice in the comments below. Perhaps the devil is in the details. The reign of the Borgias was a short, violent, and brilliant flame that consumed itself. When Pope Alexander VI died in 1503, likely from malaria but widely believed to have been accidentally poisoned by his own son Cesare, the family's power structure collapsed overnight. Cesare, sick and without the protection of the papacy, was captured and exiled, eventually dying in a minor skirmish in Spain. Their enemies returned to Rome and methodically erased the Borgia name from monuments, reclaiming their power. But the story of what they represented, the fusion of absolute spiritual authority with absolute temporal ruthlessness, was not erased. It became a cautionary tale, a legend that would echo through the courts of Europe. It demonstrated that even the Vicar of Christ could, in the pursuit of earthly power, adopt the methods of his eternal adversary. The Borgia papacy was a symptom of a deeper sickness, a world where the thirst for power and knowledge was leading men to kick down doors that had been locked for a reason. And just as the Borgia nightmare ended, another, even more personal and grotesque horror was unfolding in France, a story that would prove that the devil did not need to sit on a throne to wreak havoc. He could find a home in the heart of a single man, a national hero, a marshal of France, a man named Gilles de Rais. Gilles de Rais was a man who should have been a legend of chivalry. He was one of the wealthiest nobles in France, a brilliant military commander who fought bravely alongside Joan of Arc to drive the English from his homeland. He was handsome, intelligent, and pious. At the coronation of King Charles VII, the king he had helped place on the throne, Gilles stood at his side, an honored hero of the realm. But behind the facade of the war hero lurked a monster of unimaginable depravity. After the war, he retired to his vast estates, including his imposing castle at Tifogus. He lived a life of extravagant, almost insane luxury, spending his immense fortune on a lavish court, theatrical productions, and a private chapel with a choir that rivaled the Pope's. but his spending soon outstripped even his colossal income. He turned to alchemy, hoping to discover the philosopher's stone and learn the secret of turning base metals into gold. And when alchemy failed him, he turned to something much, much darker. He sought a more direct path to forbidden knowledge and limitless wealth. He decided to summon the devil. The cellars of his castles, particularly Tiphagis, were transformed from wine cellars into laboratories and ritual chambers. Guided by a group of unscrupulous sorcerers and alchemists, Gilles de Rais began a series of experiments in demonology. He sought a pact. He wanted knowledge, wealth, and power from the infernal legions. The demons, he was told, demanded offerings, not incense or prayers, but the blood and organs of the innocent. And so began one of the most horrific killing sprees in history. Agents of the Marshal began scouring the surrounding countryside, abducting children, primarily young boys from peasant families. They were lured to his castles with promises of work or food, and then they vanished. Inside the castle walls, these children were subjected to unspeakable tortures, ritualistically murdered, and dismembered as part of Gilles de Rais' occult ceremonies. He was not just a killer, he was a connoisseur of death, a man who derived a terrifying aesthetic and sexual pleasure from the act of murder. The hero of France had become a real-life Bluebeard. What turns a hero into a monster? Is it a flaw in their character, or is it the power they hold that corrupts them? The disappearances mounted. Hundreds of children vanished over a period of years. The peasants whispered in terror, but who would dare to accuse a Marshal of France, a friend of the king? Gilles de Rais seemed untouchable, but his arrogance and his dwindling finances made him careless. A dispute with a clergyman brought him into conflict with the church, and a political misstep alienated him from the powerful Duke of Brittany. Suddenly he was vulnerable. The rumors that had been circulating for years finally reached the ears of authorities who were now willing to listen. An investigation was launched, led by the Bishop of Nantes. The Marshal's accomplices, his loyal servants, who had procured the victims and assisted in the rituals, were arrested. Under interrogation, they broke down and confessed everything. Their testimony, preserved in the court records, is a chilling, detailed account of the horrors that took place at Tiphagis. They described the rituals, the incantations, the demonic apparitions Gilles claimed to have seen, and the brutal, systematic slaughter of as many as 600 children. The scale of the crimes was so vast, so monstrous, that the judges at first could not believe it. The trial of Gilles de Rais in the year 1440 was a sensation that shocked all of Europe. He was tried simultaneously by an ecclesiastical court for heresy and demonology, and by a civil court for murder. At first, he was defiant, using his rank and reputation to insult the judges. But when faced with the detailed confessions of his closest aides, and perhaps the threat of torture himself, his arrogance shattered. He broke down and gave a full, tearful confession in open court, confirming the stories of his accomplices and adding even more grotesque details. He spoke of his pacts with a demon he called Baron, of his descent into madness and cruelty, driven by a lust for power that could never be satisfied. He was found guilty on all charges. He was excommunicated, sentenced to death, and hanged and burned at the stake. Was he truly a Satanist who had made a pact with the devil? Or was he a profoundly psychopathic serial killer, a madman who used the occult as a justification for his pre-existing monstrous appetites? The line between the two is often a matter of perspective. He was a man who had everything, fame, wealth, and honor, and he threw it all away in a quest for something more, a quest that led him into an abyss of his own making. The fall of a great warrior into such darkness was a terrifying spectacle. It suggested that the soul of even the most noble knight could become a battleground, and that the Renaissance quest for knowledge had a dark, irrational twin. This nightmare unfolded not only in France but also in the very cradle of the Renaissance, the sophisticated and brilliant city of Florence, where the pursuit of ancient wisdom was about to collide with a firestorm of religious fanaticism. Florence in the 15th century was the intellectual and artistic heart of Europe, a city blazing with the genius of Brunelleschi, Botticelli, and a young Leonardo da Vinci. It was a republic ruled in all but name by the Medici family, bankers who had transformed their immense wealth into unparalleled political power. Cosimo de' Medici, the patriarch, was not just a ruler, he was a patron of a new way of thinking. He sponsored the rediscovery of classical philosophy, funding scholars to translate the lost works of Plato and other Greek thinkers. He established the Neoplatonic Academy, a circle of intellectuals led by the brilliant Marsilio Ficino. On the surface, their goal was noble: to synthesize Christian theology with the wisdom of ancient Greece to find the divine spark in humanity. But as they delved deeper into the esoteric texts of the past, the Corpus Hermeticum, the Chaldean oracles, they were treading on dangerous ground. They were exploring theurgy, the ancient art of summoning and commanding spiritual beings. Was this a center of humanism or a secret coven of magi, seeking to recreate the mysteries of the ancients? In an age of paranoia, the distinction was easily blurred. The Florentine Renaissance was not just a rebirth of art, it was a rebirth of everything, including paganism. Ficino and his circle were not trying to summon demons in the way Gilles de Rais had. They were intellectuals attempting to achieve a higher state of consciousness, to communicate with angels and planetary spirits through music, talismans, and philosophical contemplation. But to their enemies, this looked like sorcery. The rituals, filled with invocations to ancient gods and the drawing of astrological charts, were easily misinterpreted as devil worship. Agents of rival families and spies from Rome infiltrated these intellectual circles, listening for any hint of heresy that could be used to topple the Medici. Cosimo and his grandson, Lorenzo the Magnificent, had to walk a fine line. They had to publicly champion the Church while privately protecting their philosophers from the Inquisition. They understood that knowledge was power, but forbidden knowledge was a double-edged sword that could easily destroy the one who wielded it. Florence became a city of whispers, where a philosophical debate in a sunlit villa could lead to an arrest in a darkened alley. The pursuit of enlightenment was shadowed by the fear of the stake. This delicate balance between intellectual freedom and religious orthodoxy was shattered by the arrival of one man, Girolamo Savonarola. A Dominican friar from Ferrara, Savonarola was a charismatic preacher of apocalyptic fire and brimstone. He saw the Florence of the Medici not as a beacon of enlightenment, but as a new Sodom and Gomorrah, a city wallowing in paganism, luxury, and sin. His sermons in the Florence cathedral drew massive, hysterical crowds. He prophesied invasions and plagues, punishments from God for the city's wickedness. He railed against the Medici, the corrupt clergy, and the Neoplatonic scholars whom he accused of being sorcerers trafficking with demons. For a time, he held the city in his thrall. After the Medici were temporarily exiled, Savonarola became the de facto ruler of Florence, establishing a brutal, austere Republic of Christ. His reign of virtue was a reign of terror. He organized bands of young zealots to go from house to house, confiscating any objects deemed sinful: mirrors, cosmetics, fine clothes, and, most importantly, pagan books and art. The climax of Savonarola's rule was the infamous bonfire of the Vanities in 1497. On the central piazza of Florence, a great pyramid of condemned objects was built and set ablaze. Thousands of priceless works of art, manuscripts and books, including works by Ovid and Boccaccio, were consumed by the flames. It was a symbolic act, an attempt to purge the city of its Renaissance soul and drag it back into an age of unquestioning faith. On that fire, not only books burned, but also the reputations and lives of those accused of heresy. The hunt for sorcerers and heretics became a tool of political control. Anyone who opposed Savonarola's regime could be accused of dealing with the devil and face imprisonment, torture, or exile. Was this a genuine spiritual revival, or the hijacking of a city by a religious fanatic using the fear of Satan to cement his own power? For the artists and philosophers of Florence, it was a new, dark age. They were forced to flee to hide their books or to publicly renounce their own work to save their lives. The city that had celebrated the beauty of the human form was now forced to shroud itself in shame. The intellectual ascent was overshadowed by paranoia and terror before the abyss of forbidden knowledge. But Florence's bonfire could not contain the forces it sought to destroy. Savonarola's extremism eventually alienated even his own supporters, and he ran afoul of the one power he could not intimidate, the Borgia Pope, Alexander VI, whom he had openly accused of being the Antichrist. Excommunicated and abandoned by the fickle Florentine crowds, Savonarola was arrested, tried for heresy, and, in a final, grim irony, hanged and burned on the very same piazza where he had held his bonfire of the vanities. The Medici returned to power and the Renaissance resumed, but it had lost its innocence. The Florentine nightmare had shown that the battle for the soul of an era was not just fought with ideas, but with fire. It was a brutal lesson in how quickly the quest for knowledge could be branded as demonic, and how the fear of hell could be used to create a living one on earth. The embers of that fire, it seemed, were carried north, across the Alps, to the glittering and treacherous court of the most powerful monarch in Europe, a king whose obsession with order and splendor concealed a dark and festering secret, a scandal that would be known as the affair of the poisons. The court of Louis XIV of France, the Sun King, was the envy of the world. The Palace of Versailles was a symphony of gold, glass, and geometric gardens, a monument to absolute power and refined civilization. Here, etiquette was a science, and a misplaced word could end a career. Life was a public performance, lived under the constant watchful eye of the king. Yet beneath this polished veneer of order and reason, the old, dark superstitions festered. The aristocrats of Versailles, for all their sophistication, were locked in a relentless competition for royal favor, for wealth, for love. And when prayers and political maneuvering failed, they turned to more direct and desperate measures. They sought out the fortune-tellers, the alchemists, and the sorcerers who plied their trade in the shadowy back alleys of Paris. This hidden world of superstition and crime would erupt into a scandal so vast it threatened to bring down the French nobility and tarnish the Sun King's reign forever. It began, as these things often do, with a whisper of poison. What would you choose to win the heart of the one you love? A powerful love potion with uncertain side effects, or a deadly poison for your rival? Choose your intrigue in the comments. The court is watching. At the heart of this sprawling criminal network was a woman named Catherine Monvoisin, known to her clients as La Voisin. She was a charismatic and cunning figure, a midwife and fortune-teller who had built a lucrative empire catering to the secret desires of the Parisian elite. Her clientele included some of the most powerful names at court: dukes, marquises, and even, it was whispered, the king's own official mistress, the Marquise de Montespan. To these desperate aristocrats, La Voisin offered a range of services. For lovers, she provided potent aphrodisiacs and love charms. For those seeking to know the future, she performed divinations. And for those with rivals to eliminate, she supplied a variety of poisons, known euphemistically as inheritance powders. But her most secret and expensive service was the one that catered to the darkest ambitions of her clients: the performance of a black mass. In a hidden chamber behind her respectable Parisian home, with the help of a defrocked priest named Etienne Guibourg, La Voisin conducted satanic rituals designed to invoke the devil's aid. These were not the sophisticated theological experiments of Florentine philosophers. They were crude, brutal rites filled with sacrilege and blood. According to the confessions later extracted by police, the ceremony involved an inverted crucifix, black candles, and a chalice filled not with wine but with a vile concoction of blood and other substances. The altar was the naked body of a woman, often the client herself. And upon this living altar, the most terrible act was performed: the sacrifice of an infant. The child's throat would be cut, its blood drained into the chalice, and its entrails used for divination. These masses were performed for a variety of purposes: to curse an enemy, to win a lawsuit, or, in the most explosive accusation of the entire affair, to secure and maintain the love of the King of France. The Marquise de Montespan, desperate to hold on to Louis XIV's affections as he began to tire of her, was said to have participated in several of these rituals, hoping that a pact with the devil could succeed where her beauty and wit were failing. The scandal broke in 1679 when the investigation into a series of poisonings among the nobility led the Paris chief of police, Nicolas de la Reynie, to La Voisin's door. Her arrest and subsequent interrogation opened a Pandora's box of horror. Under torture, she and her associates began naming their clients. The list was a who's who of the French aristocracy. La Reynie and the king were stunned. The rot went deeper than they could have ever imagined. To handle the unprecedented crisis, Louis created a special tribunal, the Chambre Ardente, or Burning Court, to investigate the affair in secret. For 3 years, the court heard testimony that painted a terrifying picture of a Parisian high society riddled with murder, superstition, and Satanism. Hundreds were arrested, dozens were tortured and executed, burned at the stake or broken on the wheel. The dungeons of the Bastille were filled with aristocrats frantically betraying one another to save their own lives. The splendor of Versailles was revealed to be a thin mask over a pit of moral decay. In the end, the scandal reached too high. When the name of the Marquise de Montespan was irrevocably linked to the infant sacrifices and plots to poison the king himself, Louis XIV faced a terrible choice: to prosecute his own former mistress and expose the full extent of the depravity at his court would create a crisis that could shatter the monarchy. He chose to save the reputation of his reign. He shut down the Chambre Ardente, ordered the official records of the trial to be burned, and had the most dangerous surviving prisoners locked away for life under the tightest secrecy. The affair of the poisons was officially over, buried under the weight of royal command. La Voisin and her key accomplices were executed, but most of her high-born clients escaped with their lives. The Sun King's court survived, but it was forever stained. The affair was a brutal reminder that behind the elegant facade of the Age of Reason, the most primitive and savage impulses still held sway. This desperate, bloody search for power and influence was not unique to France. Across the English Channel, in a nation that prided itself on liberty and enlightenment, the elite were finding their own, more philosophical but no less scandalous, ways to dance with the devil. As the smoke cleared from the Chambre Ardente in France, a different kind of fire was being lit in Great Britain. The 18th century, the so-called Age of Enlightenment, was a time of reason, scientific discovery, and political philosophy. But for the British aristocracy, it was also an age of profound boredom and cynicism. Having secured immense wealth and power through colonial expansion and political stability, a segment of the ruling class found themselves with too much time, too much money, and not enough taboos left to break. They sought new, more refined forms of rebellion. This impulse gave rise to the notorious Hellfire Clubs, secret societies for the elite where, under the guise of classical parody and intellectual wit, shocking rituals, sexual orgies, and blasphemous mockeries of Christian rites were practiced. These were not desperate pleas for power like those in Louis XIV's court. They were the arrogant pastimes of men who already had everything and sought to prove they were above the laws of both God and man. The most famous of these clubs was founded in the mid-18th century by Sir Francis Dashwood, a wealthy and eccentric baronet who would later become Chancellor of the Exchequer, the man in charge of the entire British economy. Dashwood and his associates, a circle that included prominent politicians, poets, and artists, called themselves the Monks of Medmenham, or sometimes the Order of Friars of St. Francis of Wykeham. They leased a ruined Cistercian abbey on the banks of the River Thames and lavishly restored it, not as a place of worship, but as a private playground for their debaucheries. The abbey's motto was changed from the original Cistercian prayer to "Fais ce que tu voudras," do what thou wilt, a phrase later made famous by the occultist Aleister Crowley. This was the club's only rule. Inside, the members, dressed in mock monastic robes, would engage in feasts, heavy drinking, and elaborate sexual orgies with prostitutes, euphemistically referred to as nuns. The rituals at Medmenham Abbey were a carefully curated blend of classical paganism, anti-Catholic satire, and outright blasphemy. The chapel was redecorated with pornographic frescoes. Statues of Harpocrates, the Greek god of silence, were placed at the entrance, reminding members that what happened in the abbey stayed in the abbey. While popular rumor later accused them of outright Satan worship, the truth was likely more complex. Their patron deities were Bacchus, the god of wine, and Venus, the goddess of love. The rituals were less about summoning demons and more about mocking the solemnity of the established church, which they saw as an instrument of social control. They would conduct parodies of the Catholic Mass, read pornographic poetry instead of scripture, and toast to the devil as a symbol of rebellion and liberty. Was this a genuine occult practice, or was it simply the ultimate expression of aristocratic privilege and impunity? For men who ran an empire, mocking the faith of the common man was perhaps the final, most exhilarating power trip. The Hellfire Club was an open secret among the British elite. Its membership included figures like John Montagu, the Earl of Sandwich, who supposedly invented the food that bears his name so he wouldn't have to leave the gambling table, and the radical politician John Wilkes. The club's activities provided endless material for political satirists and moral crusaders, who depicted Dashwood and his friends as a cabal of diabolical conspirators plotting to corrupt the nation. While these accusations were exaggerated, the club's influence was real. The secrecy and the shared transgressions created powerful bonds of loyalty and blackmail among some of the most influential men in the country. Decisions that affected the course of the British Empire may well have been made between drunken orgies in a ruined abbey. The club's activities eventually faded as its members grew older and the political climate changed, but its legend endured as a symbol of the hypocrisy at the heart of the Enlightenment, an age of reason for the masses governed by an elite who reserved the right to be as irrational and debauched as they pleased. This particular brand of aristocratic rebellion, the use of blasphemy as a form of intellectual and social protest, was a uniquely 18th century phenomenon. It was the product of an age of supreme confidence, a time when the ruling class felt so secure in its power that it could afford to play with fire without fear of getting burned. They did not need to make pacts for power, they already held it. Their rituals were a game, a form of theatre designed to shock and to affirm their own elite status. But this game was being played on the edge of a volcano. The intellectual currents of the Enlightenment, which the Hellfire Clubs twisted into a justification for their own licentiousness, would soon fuel revolutions in America and France. The old order of aristocratic privilege was coming to an end. The next great empire to be gripped by a fascination with the occult would not be one at the height of its power, but one on the brink of a terrifying and bloody collapse. The whispers of dark forces would be heard not in a gentleman's club, but in the most sacred heart of a dying dynasty, the court of the last Russian Tsar, in the shadow of a mad monk named Rasputin. The Russian Empire at the dawn of the 20th century was a colossus on feet of clay. 300 years of Romanov rule were crumbling under the pressures of modernization, political unrest, and a disastrous war with Japan. The court of Tsar Nicholas II was an isolated, gilded bubble, hopelessly out of touch with the suffering of its people. Into this atmosphere of anxiety and decay stepped one of the most enigmatic and controversial figures in modern history, Grigory Rasputin. He was a Siberian peasant, a wandering holy man, a starets who possessed a mesmerizing charisma and, it seemed, a miraculous healing power. He gained access to the imperial palace through his ability to treat the hemophilia of the young heir to the throne, Alexei. For the desperate Empress Alexandra Feodorovna, a deeply religious and mystical woman, Rasputin was a man of God, a divine messenger sent to save her son and the dynasty. For nearly everyone else in Russia, he was the holy devil, a debauched charlatan whose sinister influence was driving the empire to ruin. Rasputin's power over the empress was absolute. She believed he was the voice of God, and she refused to hear a word against him. Through her, his influence extended to the Tsar and to the highest levels of government. Ministers were appointed and dismissed on his whim. Military strategy was altered based on his visions. This peasant mystic, who could barely write his own name, was effectively ruling Russia. The court and the capital buzzed with lurid rumors about the nature of his power. It was whispered that he was a member of the Klisti, a secret and illegal religious sect that practiced self-flagellation and ritualistic sexual orgies as a means of achieving ecstatic union with the divine. His notorious drunkenness and lechery were well known. He held court in his apartment, surrounded by a throng of female admirers, from high society ladies to prostitutes, dispensing spiritual advice and sexual favors in equal measure. The stories of his orgies, whether true or exaggerated, painted a picture of a sacred monarchy being defiled by a demonic force, a belief that shattered the last vestiges of respect for the Tsar and his family. The political chaos caused by Rasputin's interference was catastrophic. Competent ministers were replaced by his incompetent cronies. The war effort during the First World War was crippled by his nonsensical advice. The country was careening towards revolution, and the Russian aristocracy saw Rasputin as the source of the rot. They believed he was not just a charlatan, but something more sinister, a German spy or even a sorcerer who had placed the Empress under a diabolical spell. His power seemed unnatural, his ability to survive previous assassination attempts uncanny. A conspiracy was formed, led by a group of conservative nobles, including Prince Felix Yusupov and the Tsar's own cousin, Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich. They decided that the only way to save Russia was to kill the mad monk. The murder of Rasputin in December of 1916 was not a simple assassination. It was a brutal, desperate act that resembled a ritual execution, a final, violent attempt to excise a cancer from the body politic. The conspirators lured Rasputin to the Yusupov palace on the pretext of a late-night party. There they fed him cakes and wine, laced with enough cyanide to kill a dozen men. To their horror, the poison seemed to have no effect. In a panic, Yusupov shot Rasputin in the chest. The monk collapsed, and the conspirators, believing him dead, prepared to dispose of the body. But as they approached, Rasputin's eyes snapped open. With a terrifying roar, he leapt to his feet and lunged at Yusupov, then staggered out into the frozen courtyard. The other conspirators shot him again multiple times. He finally fell, but still he struggled, clawing at the snow. In a frenzy, they bludgeoned his body with a club before binding him and throwing him through a hole in the ice of the Neva River. When his body was recovered days later, the autopsy revealed that his final cause of death was drowning. Even after being poisoned, shot, and beaten, he had still been alive when he hit the water. His almost supernatural vitality only confirmed for many that he was indeed something more than human. The murder, however, did not save the monarchy. It came too late. The revolution was already inevitable. The dark charisma of one man had become the final push that sent a 300-year-old dynasty tumbling into the abyss, an abyss from which a new and even more terrifying ideology would emerge, one that would systematize the occult on an industrial scale. The fall of the Romanovs was more than the end of a dynasty. It was the end of an era. The old world of aristocrats and kings with their secret societies and courtly intrigues was swept away by the brutal tide of totalitarianism, but the fascination with occult power did not disappear. It mutated, transforming from a tool for personal ambition into a pillar of state ideology. In the ashes of a defeated Germany, a new political movement was rising, one that was deeply intertwined with a toxic brew of racial mysticism, pagan revivalism, and esoteric beliefs. The National Socialist German Workers' Party did not just seek political power, it sought to remake the very soul of the German people, and its leaders drew inspiration from the darkest corners of occultism. The secret rituals of the courtly elite were about to be replaced by the public spectacles of a state-sponsored death cult. The intellectual roots of the Third Reich can be traced to a number of Ariosophist and nationalist occult orders, that flourished in Germany and Austria in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Groups like the Germanenorden and its more famous offshoot, the Thule Society, attracted a mix of disaffected aristocrats, industrialists, and political agitators. The Thule Society, founded in Munich in 1918, served as a crucial meeting point for many of the future leaders of the Nazi Party, including Rudolf Hess and Alfred Rosenberg. This was not a gentleman's club for blasphemous fun. It was a deadly, serious organization dedicated to a racist ideology. They believed in a mythical Aryan race originating from a lost polar land called Thule. They performed rituals aimed at tapping into the supposed racial memory and psychic power of this master race. While Adolf Hitler himself was more of a cynical pragmatist who used these ideas rather than a true believer, the occult Gnosticism of the Thule Society provided the ideological framework and the early organizational structure for the nascent Nazi movement. Once in power, the fascination with the occult became institutionalized. Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, was the true high priest of the Nazi cult. He saw the SS not just as an elite police force, but as a new knightly order, the reincarnation of the Teutonic Knights. He took over the medieval Wewelsburg castle and began transforming it into a mystical command center for his black-robed officers. The castle was to be the center of the New World, where SS leaders would participate in secret rituals designed to cultivate their Aryan spiritual powers. Himmler also founded the Ahnenerbe, the Ancestral Heritage Organization, a pseudo-scientific body tasked with proving the racial theories of the Nazis. The Ahnenerbe launched expeditions around the world, from Tibet to South America, searching for evidence of the Aryan race and for mystical artifacts like the Holy Grail and the Ark of the Covenant, which Himmler believed would grant Germany invincible power. This was no longer the private pursuit of a corrupt noble. It was the policy of a modern state, wielding the full power of its bureaucracy and military in a deranged quest for magical supremacy. The contrast between the public propaganda of the Third Reich, its rallies, its marches, its carefully constructed image of order, and the secret rituals of its leadership is stark. While the German people were being fed a diet of nationalist fervor, the inner circle was engaged in a bizarre form of state-sponsored black magic. The result was not just a world war, but a holocaust, a scientifically managed industrial-scale slaughter that was, at its core, a ritual of purification, an attempt to exterminate those deemed racially and spiritually inferior. The madness of a single man like Gilles de Rais had become the cold, calculated madness of an entire state apparatus. The ancient promise of the serpent, "You shall be as gods," found its ultimate, horrific expression in the ideology of a master race that claimed the right to decide who lived and who died. The dream of absolute power, pursued for centuries in the secret chambers of kings, had finally burst out into the open, consuming the world in fire. After the war, the world tried to forget. The horrors of the Nazi regime were attributed solely to political and economic factors. The deep, strange roots of its occult ideology were largely ignored or dismissed as a lunatic fringe. In Operation Paperclip, Allied intelligence services recruited Nazi scientists, engineers, and, it is whispered, intelligence officers with expertise in psychological warfare and esoteric practices, giving them new identities and putting them to work. The secrets of the Ahnenerbe were absorbed into the archives of the Cold War superpowers. The real history of elite ritualism was systematically buried, replaced in the public imagination by a new myth, the Satanic Panic, of the 1980s. This wave of mass hysteria, fueled by sensationalist media and dubious testimonies, created a caricature of devil worship that had little to do with the historical reality. It was a useful distraction, a noisy fiction that helped to obscure a quiet and much more disturbing truth. The ancient evil did not vanish. It simply learned to hide in plain sight, no longer concealed in the dungeons of castles, but dissolved in the endless, deafening noise of information. The greatest secret is that there is no secret left to uncover, only a truth so vast and uncomfortable that we choose not to see it. The rituals continue, but the altars have changed. They are no longer made of stone, but of stock prices, election results, and the silent, willing consent of the distracted.